Welcome back to the Science and Art of Open Water Swimming. With International Women's Day fresh in everyone's mind, today's episode focuses on women's health, physiology, and the factors that shape performance and well-being in female endurance athletes. Our guest is Associate Professor Claire Badenhorst, a leading researcher whose work spans exercise physiology, iron regulation, and women's health. Claire began her academic journey here in Western Australia, completing her PhD at UWA before spending the last 9 years at Massey University in New Zealand, developing impactful research on menstrual health literacy, iron deficiency, and the lived experience of female athletes. She has recently returned to WA as the Director of Research at East Metropolitan Health Service. Claire also brings her own background in endurance sport, from triathlon to open water swimming, including completing the Rottnest Channel Swim. In this episode, we'll explore menstrual health, iron status, well-being, and the insights Claire believes can support and empower female athletes. Let's dive in. Claire, welcome to the podcast. I really appreciate you giving your time to come and chat to us, especially as we're around International Women's Day. Before we talk about your research and women in sport and swimming, I'd really like to get a bit of background on you and related to your swimming, your triathlon, your open water experiences.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me, Grant. So I guess I always describe my background as I came very much from an endurance sports background. Primarily did a whole lot of swimming in high school, and then post-school I found my way into triathlon, which I very actively competed in for probably close to 15 years, if I'm going to be honest. This was a very long relationship I had. During that time, I raced in both Perth, Australia, and then in New Zealand, where I have been living for the last 9 years. So I've been very fortunate to actually participate in endurance events, both within Perth, Western Australia, where I've completed the Busselton half Ironman. I never made the Ironman there, but I did do the half Ironman, and the Rottnest Channel Swim, which I have done both solo and in a team with some great people as well. And then a whole lot of short course here in WA, plus pretty much every single long distance race in New Zealand, including Wanaka, Mount Maunganui, and of course the iconic New Zealand Ironman and half Ironman in Taupo, which are probably some of my favorite races. I will admit the scenery there is amazing. So it's a bit of a summary of my background.
And you're describing some great locations, and as you say, the environment is amazing. What drew you to that sort of endurance sport, those aquatic sports, beyond just swimming at school?
If I'm going to be completely honest, I had a very strong narrative of myself, which is I had no hand-eye coordination, but I was very good at doing things in a straight line. And I pretty much have always been quite good at the endurance events, even from a young age, almost seemed to have one gear. And I would get in that one gear and I could just stay there. Whereas if you told me to sprint, it would look the exact same as that one gear. So I think I naturally found my way into there purely because I could very effectively do swimming, biking, and running all at a fairly reasonable pace for quite a long time. And only now am I really trying to expand that narrative and actually look at seeing if I can improve that hand-eye coordination.
So you did mention Rotto and the Channel Swim. Can you display your number plates again now you've moved back to WA?
I probably should consider that, actually. They're probably somewhere in a shed or a storage container at my parents' house. I maybe should dig those out. But I actually forgot about those. I should probably whip them out. Thanks for the reminder.
Oh, you should display them proudly. What was the experience like? I mean, your numbers 10.99, so it was a while ago. But what was your experience like for that swim?
I remember it being one of the best endurance events that I ever participated in. I was quite young at the time. I think I was 21. And I pretty much did the swim because there was an older guy at the swim squad that told me he didn't think I could do it. And that was pretty much the only convincing I needed. But I just remember being so incredibly nervous, but so excited. And I remember at 10K actually declaring myself a bit of an idiot, of which my mother's response from my support boat was, "It's taken you 10 kilometers and 21 years to figure that out." So I just carried on swimming. I will admit that during that event, I actually ended up with quite severe bursitis in my right shoulder, and it got to a point where it was quite bad, maybe 3 kilometers out from the finish. I was too scared to tell my support crew because I thought they were going to pull me out. Pretty much by the time I got to the finish line, I couldn't actually lift my arm anywhere near shoulder height. But it was actually just one of the most satisfying achievements that I've to date ever achieved. And I'm so incredibly proud of the fact that I did that, even at like a relatively young age, I would say, at that time. But yeah, I have very fond memories despite bursitis and everything like that went along with it.
So you studied at UWA, you completed a PhD exploring carbohydrate intake, inflammation, hepcidin and iron.
Mm-hmm.
What sparked your interest in that area?
As a, I guess, endurance athlete at that time, that was very much into competing in triathlons at that point. Like I just finished doing my solo Rottnest swim. I was always struggling with iron deficiency, and it was very much a lived experience for me. And so when there was the opportunity to look at a project that would consider all those aspects that I had actively engaged in, so sport, dietary intake, how we're looking at that, and how it could maybe support my iron levels, it pretty much seemed like a no-brainer to me. And so there was very much an intrinsic motivation there for me to get involved in that topic. Quite a selfish endeavor, we might say. But yeah, that was one of my primary reasons for choosing it.
Well, I think it's really important whenever we go down that research path that we have a why, and if it's your own personal development as well, I think that's an excellent idea. How did your research then evolve during your time at Massey Uni in New Zealand?
It was quite interesting because I think when you finish your PhD, you're almost like let out into the world to build your own research profile, which can be quite daunting. And then, of course, I decided to move country as well. So we're all about a few challenges in the mix there. But coming from that basis of doing a lot of research in iron status, looking at these other strategies, I was forever reading research papers on women are prone to iron deficiency because they menstruate. And for me, the numbers just didn't add up, if I'm going to be honest, because there's more individuals that menstruate than when you look at the statistics on how many of those individuals are iron deficient. So if our bodies have evolved to menstruate, and this is a physiological process that we experience for at least 4 decades of our life, surely that is not just an adverse kind of symptom that leads to this nutrient deficiency. There must be other factors. And it was from, again, that question that I had, and just really being not satisfied with the information I could find in that space, that I really wanted to explore different areas in this kind of how women interact with their physiology. But a lot of my research then dived into that understanding of menstruation, of iron status. What is that experience for women, both athletes, active individuals, general population, to really start like teasing apart some of these questions that it just seemed so obvious to me, but also just I could not find an answer to that satisfied me. And it was from that basis that a lot of my research in New Zealand grew very much into looking at addressing some of those key questions that I had in that topic.
And so, what's now brought you back to WA? What is your role the role as Director of Research at East Metro Health Service involve, and how does that link in?
Well, naturally with that research development, looking at iron status in women. My research did take a bit of a swivel from looking very specifically at athletes to actually looking at health implications, health and performance outcomes for, as I said, general population, public health. How does that all fit into that? So I started developing a bit of a more like health orientated research profile within that topic as well. And I love New Zealand, I will admit that. It is a beautiful country. But after 9 years, I was a little bit homesick and I really missed Australian summers. And so there was a little bit of motivation there, as well as my partner. He was very keen to move back to Australia as well. And so we were at that like very interesting life stage where you're like, okay, if you're going to make the change, you've got to do it now. And so I was just looking for all those different opportunities to come back and actually do research in the space, and an opportunity presented where I could come and support clinicians within the East Metropolitan Health Service. So in our various hospitals here, so Royal Perth, Bentley, Armidale, Kalamunda, in looking at how we could build their research capacity, their research literacy, and how that could enable very impactful research projects that, and impactful in the way that they have direct impact for the patients. You can see those outcomes almost quite immediately because the questions they're asking, they're really based on their lived experience with the patients that they're working with every single day. So went for it, and here we are now.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're all, from an athlete, coach athlete, science athlete perspective, we're always looking at ways we can improve the performance of an athlete. But quite often it comes back to the healthy athlete. And so the work you're doing now, although it's general population, we need to have a healthy athlete to have that basis to then evolve and to perform at a higher level.
Absolutely. And I also always think that performance is quite relative to the individual. And so as sports scientists, we're often trained to look at how to optimize someone so that they can perform well within their given life, whatever that performance may be. And so we often don't look too much as like, there's a problem, we've got to fix it. We always look at how do I maximize that person's potential. And I think that slightly different perspective actually can be quite helpful in a lot of that kind of health orientated research as well.
So just sort of moving more into the menstrual health and athletic performance, they've done quite an extensive amount of work on menstrual health literacy. What are the biggest misconceptions or maybe knowledge gaps you see among female athletes and coaches?
This is a really interesting area because when you do actually assessments that try to quantify the level of individuals' menstrual health literacy, it will be influenced by so many different factors. So it will be influenced by what these individuals have been exposed to within their schooling years, but also the type of education and information that they have potentially received in being an athlete and a coach. Plus, in this day and age, we've also got the information online, dissemination of information through social media resources, which is becoming quite a prominent way in which people are acquiring health information. Generally, what we actually found when we did our assessment of menstrual health literacy is that when it comes to the very basic information about menstrual cycle, almost that physiology and what's actually occurring, the very general description that you are almost taught in your, I would say, your sex education, health classes, that very basic level of knowledge, that is known quite well, but it's also the same information that you'll see reiterated over and over and over again from so many different resources. What we actually found was missing was actually the comprehension of what the different hormones did in the body, what impact they had within, say, on menstrual bleeding, or what it did to the uterus lining, and or understanding that this is not just a fixed physiological system that occurs very consistently every single month, that because it's a physiological system, it's subject to variability and it can adapt and change. And it's that knowledge of that variability and that adaptability every month that is something that's almost just outside the bounds of people's current knowledge. So as soon as we ask questions, for example, like, what is the role of progesterone? Not where is it high, or where is the highest levels of it? It's that kind of information, that next level of comprehension that people tended to struggle with. Or if it was like, what is describe the variability, those kind of pieces of information there. So in that terms of that functional health literacy, it was that comprehension around what was the impact or the influence, as well as what was the variability. And as a result from that, I think a lot of research has shown that when it comes to not so much the functional health literacy, but more the next tier, which is known as your critical health literacy, where you can communicate and comprehend some of the health information that you have. Often a lot of research will show that there is slight challenges within an athletic setting there between athlete support staff and their coaches as well. Generally, in an all-female environment, research has shown that females might be more willing to have those discussions with support staff and coaches. However, as soon as it's towards maybe more male staff, there's almost like a bit of a barrier that they need to get over. Not saying that everyone experiences it, but it is a challenge for a lot of women to actually have those kind of conversations. And I always like to keep in front of mind as well that with this level of health literacy, these discussions, it's not only the athlete's knowledge, but also the coach's knowledge, and whether or not the athlete perceives the coach will understand and respond appropriately to that. And the additional layer that sits on top of that is also cultural and social context as well. You might have someone that's incredibly well educated in this space, but culturally it's quite inappropriate for them to go to a male and actually start discussing their menstrual cycle, and enforcing that on individuals might actually not be the most appropriate thing to do. So there's also an element of, is low levels of health literacy actually not necessarily the case, but actually potentially a more cultural and social mirror that we're actually not looking through when it comes to some of these discussions in that sporting environment as well.
That's really interesting, that last piece around the social side and the cultural side. So how does the menstrual cycle influence training tolerance, recovery, or performance in these endurance athletes?
This is such an interesting question because today the research is quite conflicting, if I'm going to be honest. When you look at the research that has measured performance, recovery at key points of the menstrual cycle, and I will preface that these key points are generally either during menstruation or primarily at the midpoint in that luteal phase, so after ovulation, when women are experiencing a stable high hormone phase. Those have been the two key areas that people have investigated. So when you do a measure that quantifies performance or recovery, generally what you will find in those kind of studies, there has been no really significant difference in the performance or the recovery for those athletes between these different phases of the menstrual cycle. I think it's really important to acknowledge you are looking at individuals in very stable physiological states. So the hormones are either low or they're high. So it's quite stable. It's not at a dynamic point in the cycle where we're having a change in those hormones. So either at the end of the cycle where we're having the withdrawal of hormones, or at the very start of menstruation, or around that key ovulation time, which can be incredibly hard to predict. I can tell you right now from research methods, incredibly hard to predict for a lot of women. And so at those dynamic points, we haven't typically actually done a lot of assessments there. However, we have got a lot of qualitative research. So this is our research where we have a bit more self-reported perceptions, interviews, focus groups where women have provided a bit of insight on their personal experience at those time points where we get those dynamic hormonal changes, often reporting increased feelings and perceptions of fatigue, low motivation. Their rating of perceived exertion maybe feels a little bit harder at those key points. So using all of that information, what we currently have available to us, generally, I think the best type of advice to follow in this instance is that actually really good periodization and training applications here, they're far superior than any of the research that we currently have available that says you need to adjust training according to a phase of menstrual cycle. Because as I said initially, it's also physiology. It's highly adaptable and variable. So what you do one cycle is, I can guarantee you right now from research results we have, it's absolutely not given to be exactly the same in the next cycle. So you're better off structuring a really good training program that has that appropriate periodization. However, I think there's incredible value in collecting individual athlete perceptions on how they feel on that day. Certain individuals will show trends in how they respond at different time points of their cycle. And I think utilizing that information within that athlete coach relationship can be incredibly important to providing a bit of context and understanding on how that training session was executed. And you might have a harder training session on the day where you don't feel good. And instead of then like an athlete getting inside their head and being like, oh, that was rubbish, I had such a bad day, it's like, okay, there's a potential explanation here. That's fine. We can consider it. And another great way of looking at it that I think a PhD student of mine once described it, she works with the Wellington Phoenix, or the football club. She described it as, you don't necessarily adjust training to individuals in a team. Like, you have a standard training that everyone is involved in. However, if an individual presents with an injury and they need to adapt that training in a way to enable them to participate with that injury, sometimes there needs to be subtle adjustments that occur to keep that individual involved. And this is where I think some of that individual contextual information can be really important in understanding how that female athlete is experiencing and engaging with their training process. So I always come back to, let's keep it simple. Let's actually go back to the research where we have a huge amount of information on, which is good quality periodization with training, structuring it that way, but recognizing the individual that you've got in front of you, encourage them, if they would like to, collect that information so that they can understand more about what's happening with their body, which might give them a bit more context around how they're executing various training sessions as well.
Oh, I think that's really good advice. Every athlete should ideally be tracking different aspects of their life, and the menstrual cycle is one of those parts, which may have an impact on a day-to-day training environment. And the more the athlete and potentially the coach knows, does give you an understanding of how you might perform.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. But also on that, what I often say to people is, although at an individual level, if you are wanting to understand more, absolutely consider making sure you're tracking your own information. Be mindful that, like, a lot of these online applications, they are based off very standard algorithms. So they might infer that you might experience something like you are ovulating now. Unfortunately, without measuring or testing if you're ovulating, I can guarantee you not everyone's ovulating like clockwork when the app says. So it's just being mindful, and especially if you are doing it, I'd probably say prioritize understanding like how long your cycle is, what symptoms you experience, and reflecting on how that maybe feels on the day when you do training. It just gives you that bit of information you need yourself. But I'm also really mindful at the end of the day that this is also health information. So almost putting on my current hat right now, that information is very much an individual's personal health information. And we've got to be mindful that there's an element of consent that has to go with that in terms of sharing that. So if we think about ethically, is it appropriate to force everyone to collect this information? And even if they choose to collect it for their own knowledge and empowerment, we cannot really ask them to share it unless they're giving us the consent to do that. And I think that's really important to acknowledge as well, because I think at this time it's just become a bit of a hot topic, and it's like, actually, this is health data.
So going back to your PhD and obviously the link to the menstrual cycle, as you were thinking, how does this fit in? And maybe if we just look at iron status and hepcidin. So your research looked at hepcidin on this iron regulation and being highly relevant in endurance sports. Why do you think that female endurance athletes were at an increased risk of iron deficiency?
I think there is very many different almost like reasons for this. I think it's a little bit of a collection of potential factors. Naturally, we know that exercise actually accelerates iron losses. And so actually, when we look at some of the research that has then been done by my supervisor, Pete, and everything like that, it has actually come out that there's potentially an increased iron need that athletes require, even nutritionally. And that's because there is that offset iron balance. There's accelerated iron losses just through the process of exercise. That can be just through natural exacerbating or increasing iron losses, but also through that increased activity of that hormone hepcidin after every exercise session. And for context, I always say to people, those single exercise sessions by themselves really don't mean much. But when you're an endurance athlete, you are doing that twice a day. It all adds up eventually. So you almost in a state where you've got this negative iron balance, which means dietary intake becomes an incredibly, incredibly important factor to consider. With that in mind, we often, especially in these kind of areas, really focus on increasing your iron intake. But this then raises another question on, we don't just sit and eat food based on a micronutrient. Like we eat a meal which has a collection of micronutrients, macronutrients, so your carbs, your proteins, your fats, and everything like that. And within this area, we know that one of the most prominent issues with endurance sports, and I'm not saying this happens to every single athlete, I will preface that, but we know that there has been a very big history, and probably one of the most well-researched areas in female athletes is the fact that there is this incredibly high prevalence of underfueling by that cohort of endurance female athletes that then has a lot of, I guess, adverse or negative health outcomes, which has been defined within that overarching syndrome of relative energy deficiency in sport. So if you are underfueling, there is a very strong likelihood that you are also under eating in terms of your micronutrient profile, as well as some of those key macronutrients, your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your fats. So you are, as a result of maybe a high exercise training load, maybe nutritional intake, consistently putting yourself in an area where you have a negative iron balance, which means your risk of becoming iron deficient is actually quite high. Now, if someone is menstruating, especially if they are a heavy menstrual bleeder, that is probably going to really ramp up the risk of becoming iron deficient. From what we can actually tell in some research that we actually completed, or that I did at Mass University, which we're currently writing up right now. It's in those like final phases before you submit it, is actually, unless someone is a heavy menstrual bleeder, changes in iron status with regular menstruation actually doesn't occur. What we actually see is quite stable iron levels. And very interestingly, what we actually see is almost like a bit of a physiology compensation because we are losing iron through menstruation. So what we actually tend to see is menstruation occurs, so you have that blood loss, and then you actually see through some of the biomarkers that you measure, we actually have this increase in iron mobilization and utilization. So a bit of a compensation within a woman's body after experiencing that loss of blood that might actually be a bit of a protective mechanism there as a result of having that menstrual blood loss. Like when you're looking at this, you can't really look at it from a single perspective, but actually it does feed into other areas within our research within endurance athletes as well. So it sits almost like hand in hand with maybe training, nutritional intake, low energy availability, iron status. Like separating it out can actually be quite challenging. You need to almost look at it quite holistically and pull it all together.
Yeah, I think that's really nice that you highlight that it's more than one component. Menstruation might have a role, but at the same time, it's the high level of dietary requirement through endurance exercise, potentially under nutrition. Is there a way to potentially increase iron absorption? Can we change when we eat post-exercise, or what sort of things can an athlete potentially do to try and maintain the higher levels of iron?
I think there's been a great series of research that has, I think, probably come following some of the work that I originally did in my PhD. Generally in that area, we did find that actually carbohydrate intake was incredibly good in terms of blunting that inflammatory response, but also reducing those hepcidin levels after exercise. So that was highly beneficial to athletes there, and that could support some of that iron absorption there. And then I think there was some incredible research done by PhD students that came directly after me with Pete that actually looked at the timing of nutritional intake, particularly iron supplements for athletes, and generally actually finding that if you maximize that intake maybe in the morning when hepcidin was naturally at its lowest was actually quite beneficial, and probably taking that tablet closer in and around the exercise training session versus quite delayed afterwards could actually be another way in which you could maximize absorption. Generally, a lot of this has looked at maybe more of the iron supplements, so actually giving some of those iron supplements. I think when we're looking at it more at a whole dietary approach, generally a lot of the research would support trying to maximize those key areas where you can increase iron intake through maybe making sure that you have some of those iron-rich meals, maybe minimizing a lot of those foods that are iron inhibitors. So unfortunately, like things like teas, coffees, some of those, unfortunately, those really great foods that you enjoy in the morning, but also unfortunately affect some of that iron absorption there. One of the most unique studies that I ever remember reading about, this incredible randomized controlled trial where females eating iron fortified cereal with kiwi fruit, very high dose vitamin C, versus iron fortified cereal with a banana. And interestingly enough, the ones that ate it with the kiwi fruit actually were able to increase their iron intake. So you've got a bit of a combination there of vitamin C really helping aid that iron absorption from a food that's fortified with iron, but you're also ingesting it in the morning when you're also experiencing your lowest hepcidin levels there. So bit of a combination, and I just thought that was an incredibly unique project that was quite beneficial as well. It pulled almost all the pieces of information there on more of a whole meal versus just a supplement.
I'm not sure if we've really defined hepcidin. You've mentioned it a few times. Could you maybe just define in simple terms? Because I don't think many of the audience would understand it.
No, and I think even when I started out, it was quite a new topic. So hepcidin is key in regulating how much iron our body absorbed. So our body is quite well organized in terms of how much iron it absorbs, because we don't have a specific way in which we can eliminate iron from our body. We lose maybe about 1 to 2 milligrams of iron a day, and therefore we only really need to absorb that amount, because if we absorb any more, what you end up with is iron overload, which can be quite toxic to the body. So actually we have this hormone hepcidin that helps almost be a gatekeeper and regulate how much we absorb to help prevent the body from entering iron overload. And then interestingly, if on the other hand, we start using iron, or we're in that negative iron balance and you're not ingesting or eating enough iron, that negative iron balance means you start using up your reserves in your body. In that case, you start moving towards iron deficiency. And interestingly, in those individuals, often what happens is hepcidin production really decreases. And in that way, it's almost like turning off the switch so that we can maximize the amount of absorption. So I like to think of hepcidin as a gatekeeper for how our body controls iron absorption.
What are some of the early signs that athletes and coaches should be aware of relating around this iron deficiency?
I think generally the first ones that present with a lot of athletes are almost those like changes in fatigue, motivation. Some individuals experience changes in mood, but generally that almost that like fatigue element is quite a prominent symptom that comes forward for a lot of individuals. I usually describe iron deficiency fatigue as that fatigue that's not resolved by a good night's sleep. So even if you are having outstanding sleep and you're waking up and you're feeling sluggish, you're feeling tired, it's like a deep set fatigue that you just can't shake. That's probably one of the more earlier signs. And I think actually quite uniquely athletes, because they are quite attuned to what's occurring in their body and happening every single training session, naturally it can be quite a noticeable symptom that many individuals will report.
Now, you've highlighted, as we've gone through, and especially with the change in your career, sort of that connection between lifestyle factors, mental health, and performance. So in your research at the moment, are you still exploring that space?
Yes, there's still a couple of key questions that I don't really have answers to. And I think as a researcher, I find that perpetually frustrating, if I'm going to be honest. So again, it comes back to that real intrinsic motivation there. And so key areas that I am really trying to understand is actually some of the more objective ways in which we can actually define heavy menstrual bleeding. The experience of heavy menstrual bleeding is known to have huge impacts on quality of life, mental well-being. It highly is very much associated with menstrual cycle distress. When you look in the literature in regards to female athletes as well, fear of heavy menstrual bleeding, breakthrough bleeding, during all of those things, it's a topic that creates a lot of anxiety for so many individuals that menstruate. But what we actually know and how we actually quantify what is heavy menstrual blood loss for an individual is so subjective at this moment, because all the research that has done quite objective measures on it, unfortunately, the gold standard method was designed in the 1960s and pretty much actually looked at, in short, collecting used products, drying them out, rinsing them, and then almost looking at how much blood was estimated to be lost within the whole fluid sample. And so even through our general description of the term menstrual blood loss, you would almost assume that the whole fluid sample is like when you cut yourself and you just see blood coming out, but it's actually a fluid sample that has mucus secretions and a whole host of other fluid components with it, of which blood is one. So our actual definitions of heavy menstrual blood loss are very much specific to a subcomponent within the total fluid sample. So when someone says heavy menstrual bleeding is 80 mils of menstrual blood or more, that's like basically giving someone a slice of cake and being like, please estimate how much flour is in that slice of cake. So in that sense, and this was a problem that we actually identified because we actually did a project collecting menstrual fluid samples. I don't actually know how I convinced women to do this, but there was a lot of women that did it for me, and bless their souls for it, I will admit, because even my research officer thought I'd lost the plot at this point. But yeah, those kind of areas of actually like how can we actually provide women with information that they can understand, that they can use to, I guess, empower themselves and understand more about what's happening, whether that be actually, yes, I am experiencing heavy menstrual blood loss. I do maybe need to consider getting my iron levels checked because, or I am experiencing heavy menstrual blood loss. This causes significant anxiety for me. What can I do to be prepared to carry on living my life and, as you say, performing, whether that's athlete or not? And I think that is actually something that I still really love doing research in, and probably even now as I step into this role within the health service, is actually encouraging that kind of, when we look at our patients, how can we also consider understanding those differences between groups? So older patients, younger patients, male, female, let's tease that out so we can actually start understanding some of these differences that occur as well. So yeah, there's still so much interest and passion in that area. I don't think I'll be done for a while, actually.
Well, I think you mentioned at the start that 50% of the population for about 40 years of their life will go through menstruation. So in terms of subject recruitment, I'm not surprised that there are people going, yes, I want to know more. Yes, I want to contribute and be involved with that, because it has a large impact on half the population. If we continue with the idea about this future health research for women, what are some of the other big unanswered questions, and where do you see the field heading in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I feel like you'd say one thing and someone's like, no, we're going to end up going a different way. Personally, where I would love to see more research done is actually, I would love more longitudinal research projects. Unfortunately, most research is in a single menstrual cycle, which in women, it literally is like taking a snapshot of time. And I think actually looking at some of those changes that can occur cycle on cycle is actually going to be so incredibly valuable in terms of expanding our understanding of this very important physiological system that women experience for so many years of their life, how it changes, but also how it responds to the environment. So for context, some of our research, again, that we've completed and are currently writing up, has actually shown that almost like that adaptive physiological response of the cycle to stresses to the environment. And the way I describe it is, as exercise is a positive stress, if I get someone to exercise, you adapt, you learn how to tolerate that more. And actually what we see with a lot of menstrual cycle physiology, or what we've seen in our data, is when there is that external stress, there is a change in the cycle, and often the initial changes are what we call a luteal phase defect. So you're getting lower levels of progesterone in that luteal phase, or you might not ovulate that cycle. That actually happens quite regularly, quite sporadically, and it's quite almost an adaptive response. Unfortunately, most women aren't aware that this happens at such frequent occurrence because your menstrual cycle length doesn't change. So you still have a regular menstrual bleed. And what I would like to see is a bit more research there in terms of going that next level, moving beyond our current information, where we actually go, this is some adaptive physiology, and we need to be understanding how it's responding, how those changes are impacting an individual. And maybe is this a more of a like, oh, okay, with this application of exercise or this training load, we're seeing this change. However, if I take it away, I'm getting this adaptation back to a healthier cycle state in this athlete. And I think there is so much potential there to move this into a bit more of a really unique, proactive, and very sensitive way of measuring training load and strain within women. Something I see could be very beneficial. So I personally would like to see the research moving that way. Others might disagree, but I think that would just be so important. And also I think another ripe area is potentially research in masters athletes, or because I'm perpetually terrified of perimenopause. The more I study the menstrual cycle, the more I'm scared of this event. Hey, I'm not ready anymore. But I think actually research in that space that will help women understand those changes at that point of their life, and what exercise and training might be like for them. Not that going through that phase and change, I think, would actually be another really important area as well.
Well, I think you've certainly got at least 5 or 10 years worth of questions there.
So many.
The beauty is you do have age on your side, so you've got plenty of time. And,
Thank you.
and which probably sets yourself up really nicely to do some sort of longitudinal study. And it's interesting you mentioned perimenopause, and that is another area where we don't know a lot, and it has been very unspoken about, and the research is quite limited in the general population as well as within an athlete masters population. If you could give one message to the sporting or even the swimming community about women's health, what would it be?
I think I come from it as someone that has, I do recognize I have been a female athlete, but I'm also a very curious and very passionate female researcher in the space. And I think the thing I'm always saying to people is that saying, like, test, don't guess. It's so easy to make assumptions around what's happening with your body. But I think as a scientist, we know that unless you collect the information that's quite objective, you are just playing a bit of a guessing game there. So I think across the board, when it comes to this space, there is a lot of information out there on what you should do and what you shouldn't do. But at the end of the day, unless you truly know what's happening within your body, there's no way in which you can communicate those key needs or that key information to your coach and what you should do. So I say, if you're interested in a space, make sure that you take that moment to kind of just reflect, start looking at even just the basic, like, when does my period start? Or when I experience this, how severely does it impact me? And just trying to see if you can interlay that with your training as well. And sometimes that can just give you that bit of context, because personally, as someone that had so many years of triathlon, before I started really diving into this, there was so many days where I would have a good training session, but I just feel rubbish about it. And oh my God, I would get in my head. And I think, if anything, if you can have that information for yourself to actually just give you that ability to step away from it, give you some space and context around how you felt that day in that training session, it's not the end of the world, you're going to be fine tomorrow. I think that can actually be so empowering. And oh my God, do I wish I knew it, because man, it would help me. And so I think from that perspective, I'd be like, I don't start changing your training program because of your cycle, but make sure you collect that, because that information can be so valuable to you in understanding how you're experiencing training and how it might feel week on week. And it's going to change week on week, month on month, day on day. That's all part of the process of training.
Okay, so last couple of quick ones. Your favorite swim set or session? Maybe something you've loved as an athlete or still enjoy doing?
Oh, I think my favorite sessions, particularly towards like my later career when I was doing more of the Ironman distance, for some reason I used to love those sessions where it was just like blocks of hundreds, but then it would be like every fourth hard. And then the next, like the block of 12, every third hard, block of 8, every second hard. I love that session. That was just like my favorite.
Awesome. I integrate these sessions into my coaching after we publish this each week. So I think the squad is going to really enjoy that one because it won't be hard the whole time. Now, is there anything that we might have missed that you think would help female athletes that are listening?
I think it is an incredibly broad topic here, and I'm just going to come back to this place of there is a lot of information out there, and some of the information, unfortunately, I wouldn't say is good quality information, and that might be my very critical perspective as a researcher. I do apologize for that. But with that, if you do have any questions, I think trying to find people who you can either ask or be referred to make sure that you get the information and the help that you need can be incredibly valuable, especially if this is an area you're wanting to explore and look into, or you have personal questions about. And I think making sure that you do go along that process to make sure you get the right information for you from some really knowledgeable people can be incredibly beneficial, because you're not then feeling like you're stuck. So that's probably like one thing I will say. Ask questions, find the right person to talk to, and make sure that they are coming with it from that kind of scientific evidence and health basis as well.
Well, I don't think you should be apologising for being critical as what you see out there. I mean, with your level of experience and knowledge, I think we should really appreciate that. Look, the honesty that you've shared some of your own personal experiences, which obviously led into this whole area of research, I've really appreciated it. I'm sure that the message is going to be taken on board by the listeners. So thank you very much for joining me, Claire.
Well, good, Grant. More than happy to.
Thanks for joining us on the science and art of open water swimming. With International Women's Day just behind us, today's conversation is a reminder of how powerful it is when women's health, performance, and lived experience are given the space they deserve. A big takeaway from today's episode is understanding your body and advocating for your needs is not only valid, it's vital. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who would benefit from these insights. You can also connect with us on Facebook for more conversations and community stories. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the water.